Many people ask, what is the high yield content that they should focus on for step one, right? High yield is kind of like a misnomer. It can be misleading because there isn't a lot of high yield things, but there are things that are likely to appear, right? High yield is anything that you actually get on your exam. If it appears on your exam, it's pretty much high yield, but that's super subjective because there's differences between exam after exam, right? So how would I approach it after taking the exam twice, spending 14 months going through dedicated and also going through the first 2 years of medical school, and then also writing this whole study resource or survival guide? This is how I personally approached it. I first went over to the USMLE website and I was able to get the 2024 USMLE Step 1 Content Area Question Distribution document. It's an infographic. It's literally just a one-page PDF that they post. And they normally don't post it until halfway through the first quarter of the year. And so the 2025 one will come out maybe around February or March. So this infographic provides a detailed breakdown of the content areas tested on USMLE Step 1, helping you understand which subjects are the most heavily represented. This document categorizes the exam's focus across various scientific principles and organ systems, giving you a clear picture of how to prioritize your study. It shows the relative percentage of questions for each topic, such as general principles, biochemistry, pharmacology, and system-based subjects like cardiovascular, renal, and respiratory. And why is this important? Because with our step 1 preparation, this guides you and helps you allocate time to areas that are more heavily weighted on for the exam so that you can target your efforts more effectively. You can never predict everything 100%, but you have a good idea based off of the percentages and the likelihood of getting stuff in, right? And so from this resource, I was able to organize a study plan that allowed me to focus on quote unquote high yield content and competencies to optimize my preparation. And so I'm a big spreadsheet person and I love charts. And so with it, I wanted to focus on what are the step 1 test content specifications for the systems. And so if we're looking at the systems, human development, that ranges from 1 to 3% of the exam. Blood and lymph and immunology, 9 to 13%. Behavioral health and nervous system stuff, 10 to 14%. MSK, skin and subcutaneous tissue, 8 to 12%. Cardiovascular stuff, 7 to 11. Renal and respiratory and urinary system stuff, 11 to 15%. GI stuff, 6 to 10%. Reproductive and endocrine, 12 to 16%. Multisystem processes and disorders, 8 to 12%. Biostats and epidemiology, 4 to 6%. Social sciences, communications and interpersonal skills, 69%, right? And so one of the things to note is that human development includes age-related findings and care of well patients. The remaining content from general principles, which used to be its own category, is now distributed across all the organ systems now. And so everything is a version of general principles within each organ system. And I mentioned before that they changed the exam incrementally from year to year. And so one of the big changes that they did from 2023 to 2024, and I'm curious to see what that looks like for 2025, is that general principles used to be ranging from 12 to 16%. And they got rid of that altogether. And so instead of having 12 to 16% of general principles as its own category, with human development being 1 to 3%, now they've distributed general principles across all the different systems. And so that's the big thing. And so all the other things are relatively the same, but you're also going to get communications, which is going to be around 6 to 9%. And you're going to have human development, which is much higher now. And so what that translates to is for human development, you're probably going to have about 6 questions out of 280 questions for any exam that you take for step 1, which is an average about 2% of the exam. So you're going to have about 6 questions. Hemonc and immunology, you're going to have about 29 questions. Behavioral health and neuro, about 34 questions. MSK and derm, about 27 questions. Cardio, about 24 questions. Renal and pulmonary, about 35 questions. GI, about 21 questions. Reproductive and endocrine, it's about 31 questions. Multisystem is about 38 questions. Biostats is about 13 questions. Social sciences, so communications, is about 21 questions. And what used to be general principles, which is about 39, will be distributed across all the rest of those. And so many people have asked me like, okay, when it comes to UWorld, why shouldn't I just do mixed blocks? And doing mixed blocks of questions in UWorld doesn't really make any sense. And mainly because we know that with our general principles, such as pathology and all that, that makes up about 7% of the exam. And on STEP, that's about 19 questions. And so In UWorld, you have about 39 questions to prepare for 19 questions on your exam, right? And so that's kind of how I use it. I'm looking at the percentage of, content area for step one for whatever content area we're talking about. And then I calculated the average amount of questions for that content area that I could expect on any step one exam. And this is just an average. So there may be a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but out of 280 questions, I could expect this average. And then I look at how many of those questions are in the UWorld question bank. And that is how I determine whether it's worth my time to do all those questions or do a portion of those questions or just orient myself towards that, right? And so if we're talking about behavioral sciences, that's about 11% of the step one exam, which translates to about 29 to 30 questions. And in the UWorld question bank, I have 139 questions to prepare for 30 questions. So that's a pretty good focus, about 4-1. And if we talk about biostats, that's about 5% of the exam, which translates to 14 questions on the actual exam. And I have 118 questions to prepare for 14. So if I just do those 118 questions and I do those maybe twice or get used to doing those, then I will be prepared for those 14 exam questions I will see. And the same thing can be said for communications. 8% of the exam translates to 21 questions, and I have 107 questions to prepare for that. So it's a high ratio of success, right? A decent amount of questions or a decent percentage and a low amount of questions so I could get more bang for my buck when I actually do these questions in practice on a day-to-day basis. General principles, again, we said that it's more distributed, but you could expect to have about 14% consistently on that exam, right? So that ranges, it's about 40 questions, and you have about 241 questions to prepare for 40 questions. It's a pretty solid thing to bank your money on. Biochemistry, that one's almost 20% of your exam. So that's like 53 questions. And so you have 156 questions to prepare for 53 questions. That's pretty good. Neuropathology, it's about 6%. And so it's about 15 questions. And so you have 119 questions to prepare for 15. Then you have your endocrine and reproductive pathology. It's about 6%. And so you have 64 questions to prepare for 15 questions. I'm going to do those 64 questions. So I make sure I get that 5 to 6%. And the same thing can be said for my hematology and oncology pathology, which is 5%. You have about 15 questions and you have 92 questions on UWorld to prepare for 15 questions. It's pretty good. Renal and pulmonary pathology, it's about 5%. So you could get about 12 questions of renal and pulmonary pathology, right? Just 12 questions. And you have 150 questions in UWorld to prepare for that 12 questions. And so it's kind of it's like a 10-1. And so, I don't know if I would spend too much time with this, but it's a moderate focus. But multisystems, right? That's about 14% of your exam. You can expect to get about 37 questions on your exam, but there's only 23 questions in UWorld for that. So I'm going to do all those questions because I'm going to get more bang for my buck doing those questions because more than likely a decent amount of those in UWorld will actually be on your exam. Genetics is about 7%. And that translates to 20 questions. And so you have 106 questions to prepare for 20 questions. Immunology, same thing. It's about 9%. And so about 24 questions. And you have about 132 questions to prepare for 24 questions. Histology and cell biology, this gets really interesting. I really enjoy this one. It's 11% of your exam. Combined, in UWorld, you only have 46 questions. But you could expect to get about 30 questions on your exam. So it has very high UWorld coverage and it's a high representation. So that 46 questions in UWorld can translate to a good portion of your exam in it. So if you get ace that's an easy 11% that you can just get. On the flip side, we have something like microbiology where it's only 10% of the exam or 13%, and you could expect 35 questions. But in UWorld, there's 347 questions. So in terms of priority, I wouldn't have this as high of a priority compared to histology and cell biology. And to go back to the content area distributions for a step, right? So we're talking about the disciplines here. So we have pathology, which is about 48%, physiology, which is about 30%, biochemistry and nutrition is about 19%, pharmacology, which is 19%, anatomy and embryology is 13%, Microbiology, 13%. Behavioral sciences, 11. Histology and cell bio is 11. Immunology is 9. And genetics is 7, right? So having this in mind, this allows you to cross-reference and see which specific areas are the most focused, right? And so some of the highlights from my analysis was that pathology it's the most represented, followed by physiology, then pharmacology, biochemistry, and then we have our hematology, immunology, and oncology. And this is a really high yield system, and mainly because there's about 30 questions, and the majority of it is like focused on pathology. So you could expect about 15 questions on that, right? So you could cross-reference these and really have an opportunity to laser focus on what areas you need to focus on without burning yourself out, and actually giving you an opportunity to start with something that is quote unquote high yield, right? And so my suggestion is to focus on the areas that have the highest percentage on step one and the lowest number of questions in the UWorld question bank, or whatever question bank that you choose. Prioritize those because those are high yield areas for step based off of your resources that you have available. I would say those are the quickest to get all the exposure on because there aren't as many of those questions relative to the representation on the exam. If anything, do them multiple times because they can only ask you so many things on these concepts in so many ways. And so UWorld or Amboss or any of those, they invest a lot of time and money into creating the resources like this to also make money off of all of us. So make it worth your while. Get your money's worth. If you know these, specifically these questions like the back of your hand, then you're setting yourself up for success. And if you do that early on, this becomes your baseline. And so when we're getting into week 6 and week 7 of dedicated, this is not a surprise to you. And that's really great. And so high areas to focus on that I would personally do, that I actually did, is biochemistry, right? You have expected 53 questions on step 1, and that translates to 156 UWorld questions. Because it's such a high priority, it's about 19% of your exam, I would prioritize this. And more importantly, a lot of people that I know, whenever they take the exam, they're like, oh yeah, there was a lot of biochem. Yeah, there should be. It's 20% of the exam. You're going to see 50 questions. Of course. Like it's a fifth of the exam. That's crazy. The next one is multisystems. It's going to be about 37 questions on step, and there's only 23 questions in UWorld. So because there's so few questions, you might as well just crank those out and study those and know all 23 questions, because if you get one of those, you're going to know it. Communications, there's going to be 21 on step. There's only 107 in UWorld. This is high relevance and very few questions, so ensure you know this. General principles, you could expect around 40, and that translates to 240 UWorld questions. This is the core of the exam, right? And it is underrepresented in UWorld, but it is high priority. So put this at the top of the list. Doing general pathology, general principles. So it's about 20 questions on the exam, and on UWorld, you only have 40 questions. So it's a 2-to-1 pretty much. And so with this low number, you could crank this out. You could do these every week and not miss a beat. Endocrine and reproductive pathology. That's about 15 questions on the exam, and it represents about 64 questions in UWorld. And so this is another big topic that you want to focus on. Moderate focus, behavioral sciences. There's about 30 questions, and there's about 140 in UWorld. So it's pretty well covered. If you spend time with this, know this like the back of your hand, you should be good. Neuropathology, you could expect about 15 questions on this, and that translates to 119 questions on UWorld. Get it done. Pulmonary and renal, it's about 12% of your exam, and there's about 150 questions. So, it's well covered. Moderate focus, I wouldn't kill yourself with this. Immunology, for sure. Get this done because there's about 24 questions, and UWorld prepares you with about 130 questions. So if you know this, you won't get caught slipping. And the same thing can be said for genetics. It's about 20 questions, and you have about 106 questions to really prepare for this. And more importantly, histology and cell biology. There's about 30 questions on the exam, and combined in UWorld, it's about 46. So get all these done. Things I would probably deprioritize and not put too much time and energy into. Yes, overall pathology, it represents about 40% of the exam. So that's 134 questions, but there's 830 questions in UWorld. So it's represented, but you could overdo it. and you can get lost in the sauce. Pharmacology, there's 500 questions in UWorld, and it represents 50 questions on STEP, which is good, but it's kind of overhyped in UWorld. So don't prioritize that as much. As long as you know the mechanisms of action and the adverse effects, you could get a lot done by doing some questions in all the other disciplines using the 4Ps method, and then supplementing it with your Anki decks and your clinical clues and your practice exams. If you know the mechanisms, you should be good. Pathophysiology and microbiology. Both of these are grossly overrepresented in STEP, and it's not a bad thing. You just need to study these selectively. So don't act like I need to kill it in microbiome. It's only worth 13%. So don't feel like you're missing anything with it. You're better off mastering your biostats and your communications before you try to master microbiome. And mainly because there's just less questions. There's only so much they could ask you on the other stuff. And so for me, key focus areas, biochem, general principles, communications. These are high impact with moderate URL coverage. Multisystem processes, get those done. General pathology, general principles, that's your bread and butter right there. And so by focusing on these areas, you can optimize your study to match Step 1's expectations while spending less time with overrepresented stuff. Thanks for checking this out. This is USMLE Step 1000, created by me, Stephen Christian, a space where you can turn your Step 1 prep into something smarter, sustainable, and stress-free. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. You can follow us on Spotify for more study tips and more audio podcast stuff, Instagram at USMLE Step 1000, and you can like the Facebook page to stay connected. Don't forget to download all the resources, all the Anki decks, the clinical clues, everything from the PDFs and everything that you saw in the videos you can find at www.step1000.com. And follow the blog for more updates as well at www.usmlestep1000.com, your one-stop shop for everything Step 1000. And if you like what I'm doing here and you want to follow or at least support, you can check me out on social media at Stuck on an Island. Thanks again, and I look forward to sharing more stuff about Step 1 prep and how to overcome these mental hurdles so that you can have the best possible experience possible. So again, I'm not going to hold you any longer, but remember, let's keep pushing forward one step at a time to 1000.